Yes, thank you. And a topic near to my heart as a veterinarian embedded in medical environment and public health environment. So I've been jumping across the fence, as I call it. And I think this topic really deserves a lot of attention. Because One Health is used widely. The term, you hear it everywhere. You would assume a lot of what we do is One Health embedded. But let's focus a little bit deeper into that. So what is this concept? It is an old concept. It started showing up in literature in the 60s. Some attribute it to Hippocrates already, who already wrote about the importance of environment in the health of humans. But a lot of it was really driven by a focus on zoonotic disease and foodborne disease coming from animal production chains. So work to improve human health. Now that view has changed, has evolved over the past few years. And there's now a new and agreed definition that was produced by the OLAP. It's a One Health high-level expert panel. And adopted by the four international organizations that form the quadripartite. And the definition is right there, and so that's a long one to read, you can look it up, but there is a couple of important elements in there. So there is, in green, the mention of people, animals, and the shared ecosystems that all need to be healthy. And looked at in a One Health focus. There is in red balance and optimize, which inherently already says something about maybe sometimes there are conflicts in the needs of the different components of the system. And health in this definition also has been much wider defined than not only the absence of disease, but also the general concept of health. There is a report coming up by the SAPEA, the Academies of Sciences, that will elaborate a little bit on the why behind these concepts. So really, centrally to this is that we are moving in One Health thinking from anthropocentric thinking to ecocentric thinking. And that is actually quite difficult. So this is a different way of looking at that, because that's of course a very vast concept, but how can we look at One Health in the context of pandemic preparedness? There I like to use this slide. It's from a well-cited publication, which really shows that we are looking at a phenomenon that many of the new epidemics arise from animal contact. We know that, we've known that for a long time, where we see that, I'm finding the pointer here, so there are numerous discovered and undiscovered diseases circulating in wildlife. They may be percolating a bit, transmitted directly or through vectors like mosquitoes, and from there occasionally spill over into people, and then usually our classical preparedness and response cycle starts when people are getting sick. There may be an intermediate cycle where this spillover happens into animals that people are more closely working with. But again, there the tendency is to start our pandemic and response cycle once people get sick. So this is really what the focus is of a lot of the talk and strengthening and capacity building that we currently see for pandemic preparedness. What is less in focus is what I call the focus on pre-emergence. So trying to understand where do these diseases come from, and can we really put some intelligence in that space as well? Because we know that once we see things spread into people, we have to run very fast to stay abreast of this. And we all know, you all know, that there are many different factors that lead to these new diseases. I like to group them into three categories. First, factors that induce the risk of spillovers, that increase the contacts, undesired contacts between humans and wild animals, for instance. Second category is spillovers have happened always, but the opportunity for spread is very different. If you have a spillover in a remote community, things may die out very fast. If that same spillover enters an urban, high-density urban area, the situation may evolve very differently. And then the third element to deal with is our growing susceptibility. We are undergoing big demographic change, aging. People live much longer through all sorts of treatments, but that also increases their vulnerability and can even form an entry path for pathogens that normally would not be that problematic. So one of the key factors here is just our presence on the globe and the footprint that we have. This is a paper that I particularly like because what it did is it tried to put that in figures. It tried to estimate the biomass taken up by mammals, different species of mammals. And what you're seeing here in orange is, this is the biomass taken up by us, by humans. In red, different shades of red, the biomass of animals that we use to feed us. And the little slivers to the left and to the right is the rest is the biomass of all wild, terrestrial, and sea mammals. So that includes anything from elephants to whales, dead whales. And as you can see, this is a very vivid picture that shows how our encroachment in this space is part of the problem. Now, if we look at zoonotic diseases and spillovers, of course, the problem is you cannot tell immediately whether a spillover will become a real problem. It may be a problem for the single individual involved, like, for instance, with rabies, that is almost invariably lethal if a person gets infected, but there's little person-to-person transmission. And zoonoses are staged based on how good they are capable of transmitting between people with increasing levels and, of course, increasing level of alert when you see more and more efficient transmission among people. And again here, there's a lot of opportunity for intervention, for actually maybe stopping epidemics in their tracks. And I want to really say, pandemics may start as epidemics. So this is where the window of opportunity lies, but this is the phase that we often miss when we think about pandemic preparedness, because that focuses primarily on very efficient spreaders, human-to-human spreaders, which is when the cat really is out of the bag. In the space here, when we are still looking at maybe stuttering transmission or limited transmission or transmission in a remote area, that's where opportunity lies for stopping or mitigating. That's really where the space is that we should cover. And there are real ongoing examples of this as we speak. They were already mentioned. Monkeypox as we speak, Lassa, MERS, a couple of reports last week, and H5N1, and I will touch upon that a little bit further. Mpox, we have seen the public health emergency after the COVID public health emergency, which was declared when we saw Mpox lineage 2 moving out of Africa into the high-risk sexual networks, and that caused the global outbreak that was just explained, that primarily was stopped by or limited by regular public health measures and community engagement, because we know by now that the vaccines that were given did not really do much to dampen the circulation because we were too late there, essentially. Now, this was declared over. The fake was for Mpox was declared over, which led to immediate protests from the African region scientists in Nature saying, hey, hang on, this is not over. Look at our region. Now, Europe was assertive in this situation. HERA purchased vaccines, therapeutics. There's a signed contract with to make some more treatments. Not huge number of treatment courses, really, if you think this would become a more fast-spreading event, but at least that was there. There was a clinical research network funded very fast, but by that time, this wave already had tapered off, so not much needed there. Now we're looking at DRC, which has seen increasing numbers of cases of mpox of a separate lineage. Already a lot of cases last year, but something really going in the wrong direction in South Kivu with new introduction, a new mpox sublineage 1 virus that seems to be very well transmitting in a heterosexual transmission network. Which involves bars and sex workers in a mining region, and there's really a cry for help from the local hospitals that really have nothing to deal with. They have no access to treatments, they have no access to vaccines. So as a virologist, I'm seeing our success stories in Europe, but I'm looking at this and say, why are we not acting here? Because this is where our next problem may come from. And then the example of H5N1, which I'm sure you're all aware. We have been looking at China and Southeast Asia for particularly the highly pathogenic H5N1 circulation, viruses that developed in the high-density poultry industry in that region, and which really led to calls for enhanced preparedness in China and in Asia with enhanced surveillance and vaccination of poultry. But that virus, those viruses sort of escaped, and during the pandemic in 2020, we really saw a global shift, a panzootic, in which H5-derived highly pathogenic viruses were established globally in wild birds. So we have this China situation now in our backyards across Europe and across the Americas. And this is a result of that. So from there, you now see new spillovers. With here the example of the spillover into commercial mammal cows that are producing massive amounts of virus in their milk, because that seems to be a weird tropism of this virus. Now, if you again look at that situation, so here we are, let's say, one of the wealthiest countries in the world, with a lot of capacity. The first analysis based on the genomic data says that the best estimate is that the first detection was 3 months late. The worst estimate is that it's 5 months late. So really delayed detection of the first case, 3 to 5 months of a virus that might turn into a pandemic pathogen. Definitely not really the level of alertness that you would want to see. There's also the human behavior side. This is a paper last week where there's now a call in California to go and drink H5N1 positive milk, because that is good to immunize, and that's human behavior. We have learned during the pandemic how important that is, but this seems to be unstoppable, and it's even legal in certain parts of the US to be able to do that. So another wild card factor here. And I find it very difficult to know where this virus will be going. And the reason why we probably are not looking at evolvement of a pandemic is not because of our actions, but simply because this virus is not so transmissible. And I think that should be a very sobering message for all of us. Of course, there is the issue that we can build on lessons from the past. This is a different way of looking at the success of the vaccine development timeline, which is really tiny if you compare that with some other infectious disease vaccines. And here too, there was an embedding in One Health studies. MERS and SARS made it on the the WHO blueprint list because of the experiences from the past, One Health problems, and because of that there was an active research agenda that made it possible to pivot very rapidly to this new problem. So important to keep investing there. So then a little bit on planetary health. So that is a concept that really was launched more recently. In essence, in a call for action by the editor of Lancet in an editorial who said really public health should be incorporating thinking about climate impacts in their future agenda. And here also again some buzzwords. So public health, so human health focused, climate focused, and also taking a broader scope of the concern about the sustainability of all our actions in the future. So that's planetary health. So it is really slightly different from the One Health definition. There are overlaps in topics. One of the topics here is, for instance, which kinds of diseases are climate sensitive, as they are now called. And by that we mean what are possible effects of the different complex climate change effects on these diseases. And this is a very interesting paper that has done a stellar job summarizing 60,000 papers to look at this question. And so they see, okay, if you look at literature about warming and the increased precipitation or extremes of precipitation that we can see, that is likely to have an effect on vector-borne diseases, so diseases transmitted by mosquitoes, for instance, and a lot of that is viral in nature and a lot of that will increase. They also said there's the precipitation and flooding is a slightly different complication of the climate change agenda, which has a risk of increasing waterborne disease, contamination, wastewater or sewage overflow, and dominated by bacterial problems. And by doing that, they really have painted this very complex picture of the cascades by which we will most likely get to deal with more climate-sensitive disease outbreaks. And here's an example. This is work from the consortium that I lead. Is called VIO, where we're looking at what if you combine data from many different sources, from mosquitoes, from birds, from horses, from humans, on a virus that we know that is in Europe and is a little bit on the move. This is what you see. So you see something seems to be coming from here, moving southward and moving northward, and those are two separate lineages driven by different types of drivers. And what we see is every country making its own preparedness plan, but you have to wonder what is going on in this region that seems to be driving the seeding of these viruses over Europe. And what can we do there, bring to the table? This happens to be a region that does not do any surveillance. And who is doing that? Whose responsibility is doing that? That's a One Health question. So if you really then ask so what kind of research and thinking do you need? That is a whole different ballgame. It's looking at information, you cannot read this probably, but information about infection dynamics in reservoirs. That's also a complex, as complex as infection dynamics are in a single species in humans, is even much more complex in these environments. It's about what triggers expansions, what triggers spillovers, and if you can understand that, what can you do about that? And also, what are the host factors that help contribute this? And these includes host factors like different mosquitoes that have different susceptibilities. Why do we see explosive outbreaks of West Nile in Southern Europe and not so in Northern Europe, where we do have the virus, we do have mosquitoes, we do at times have conditions that are really favorable. We do not yet see the outbreaks. Why is that? So that's my short wrap up here. So take-home message is One Health and planetary health focus on understanding more the root causes of new diseases that are coming up. Very complex, but I think valuable because many of these diseases can be detected before people get sick. And there's a lot of risk in there, but I do think that there is room for improvement. So that could eventually lead to true prevention. And in my view, we should at least have the ambition to try for some of the infections. Cost-benefit, there are studies ongoing, and the SAPEA report will talk about that. Really, I'm a little bit strict, but if I say, despite the experience in the COVID pandemic, this is not what we're doing. Look at H5N1 in the US, which I think is almost shameful. So my recommendation would be to, in addition to the clinical preparedness and the laboratory preparedness, really think about an ecosystem research preparedness component to see if we can learn to get further ahead of the curve of the issues that we are, in part self-created, going to see in the future. Just important to acknowledge that work and thinking that I present here comes from a big group of people who also have received funding to do the work, the VIO Consortium, and I'm leaving tonight because we have our consortium meeting, EDCTP3 for the monkeypox work, the Durable HERA network, and to the right, several of the Dutch national funding schemes.
Thank you very much. That was super interesting. I'm sure there are questions. I have a question, actually, but I don't know if it's the right moment to address it. I wrote down migration, question mark. Is that something that worries you? You?
Bird migration does.
Well, that's a start.
So migration is a multitude of things, right? So yes, so migration, you can see as, you probably talk about human demographic shifts, if they are large scale. I think everything that introduces change in an ecosystem, if you think about us being part of an ecosystem and you have an abrupt change in there, you have to start thinking about what does that do to the different pathogen and interactions that are also in that shared ecosystem. That's how I think we should look at that. So one of the migration questions in birds is that we have seen that there's a migratory route opening in Greenland and Iceland that used to be not relevant because of the warming and because of the retracting of the ice, which opens lands that are favorable for geese, then that now start finding a mixing area where the flyways over Europe and Africa and the flyways over the Americas interact. That's new, and we've seen H5N1 using that highway to cross over from Europe to the US. So that's really a very, one example of how these patterns of change really can have an effect, and a quite abrupt effect.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. In your rich experience, which arguments can we use to convince low and middle income countries to really embrace a One Health approach instead of keep on focusing on an anthropocentric approach? Also during the pandemic accord the negotiations, that was something that stirred a lot of confusion and a lot of I think, bad faith between parties that were negotiating. So maybe if you have some arguments that we could use there.
If I'm very honest, I think there's actually more traction for One Health approaches in, for instance, the African region than in our region. And I think that is because the starting point is so different. So, for instance, there's the International Pathogen Surveillance Network that was developed, which is coordinated through the WHO Pandemic Hub, and that is interacting with communities across the globe. And One Health is really a very common theme discussed from the African region. So we may actually stand to learn from them rather than the reverse. My personal view is that maybe it's more difficult because we have these established silos that need to then maybe rethink a little bit how the interactions work. And look at the H5 situation. So let's hope this virus is not on the move, H5N1, into humans. If it does, we should have acted 5 months ago. That's all I can say. If it does not, we're lucky, because this happened to be a not so human transmissible virus. So we see really a bit of indecision here, where right now the veterinary field is in charge. Even CDC cannot move in to the States and do the proper studies. And this is, and we've seen that happen in Europe as well, when there was H5N1 in cats in Poland. So these are old embedded mechanisms that also need to sort of rethink their ways of working.
I think a lot of rethinking has to happen, generally. It was just me asking for a friend.
I really think everyone needs to get out of the comfort zone.
Yes, I think so too.
Thank you. Els Torele, Global Health Equity Researcher. You made a very compelling case that we need to do more efforts to stop outbreaks when and where they happen. And we see a lot of attention today on pharmaceutical countermeasures, and you made the remark yourself, where we have major equity issues that are related to the fact that they function in a market system where actually it only becomes a real market when we have a big epidemic or a pandemic. So the market works against medical, pharmaceutical countermeasures to stop epidemics when and where they occur, if they're still small. So what are your thoughts about the focus? I mean, should we still focus on those pharmaceutical countermeasures, or are there other things that are maybe more powerful, or should we spread our attention more to actually do more of that, stopping them where they happen and when?
Yeah, tough question, right? So, of course, there is a market mechanism in this, and I think so if you really have a big pandemic, then the market will work, and we've seen that. I think the market failure is particularly clear when it's smaller. When why do we not have enough vaccines for yellow fever and for mpox and for right now? Because that's where there's not really that market mechanism. So I think, but that's also, if you think that's the space where we actually may be able to block, then maybe that needs to be a big public funding mechanism to see if that can be developed. So I'm less worried about the vaccines that, if you have a perspective on a global vaccination program, there's profits to be made, that's less challenging. But the smaller ones, if there could be a case for a public investment in niche vaccines, MERS, a couple of cases this week, what's going on? MERS camel vaccination would be wise, rather than waiting until we have a human MERS-derived epidemic. So that, I think, is a niche that we should be exploring. And then also making, what does the sharing mechanisms do? So we've seen it with COVID. AstraZeneca was offered to the African region when the side effects happened. That's really not fair sharing. What about the mpox vaccines that we do have in Europe that could be working importantly in DRC? So those kinds of things are really what I think we need to see addressed. And it's usually challenging, I'm fully aware of that.